The road to ending this war, the road to peace, passes through Beijing more than it does Washington, Kyiv, or Moscow. China has an oversized influence. I'd like them to use their influence for the good of the world.
Lindsey Graham's last bill has a China problem. And yeah, I'm talking about that exact Russia sanctions bill that Senator Graham had been working on for almost 2 years. Senator Graham died suddenly at the age of 71, shortly after returning from his 10th wartime trip to Kyiv. And he talked about that bill over there in Ukraine. Right now, senators, his colleagues, are talking about passing the Russia sanctions bill. And that would be a real tribute. But also, that would be a test, because the most explosive provision in Senator Graham's original bill was not really aimed at Russia. It was aimed at the countries keeping Russia's war economy running and the rockets flying to Ukrainian cities. Senator Graham was explicit about which country mattered most: China. Now Washington says an updated version of the bill is finally moving forward, but we haven't seen the text. We know the scope of the penalties has been narrowed. We know that Senator Graham himself said that the new version would focus on 5 countries buying Russian energy for resale. But we do not yet know whether it will still directly threaten China's enormous purchases of Russian crude. President Trump describes himself as tough on Russia. But does it mean tough on the main sponsor of Russia's war? Before we look into it, please hit that like button. It tells YouTube that there is an audience for foreign policy coverage that doesn't require shouting. And don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's get back to China. The Sanctioning Russia Act was a broad package. It contained direct sanctions against Russian officials, banks, state-controlled companies, sovereign debt, energy investments, and financial transactions. But its signature weapon was a secondary tariff. Under the original text, if the president determined that Russia was refusing to negotiate peace in good faith, the United States would impose a tariff of at least 500% on goods and services imported from any country knowingly buying or trading Russian oil, gas, uranium, or petroleum products. 500%. In practice, it would make almost any trade with a targeted country commercially impossible and useless. But that was the point. The bill was designed to force governments to choose: continue buying discounted, cheap Russian energy, or maintain normal access to the American market. Senator Graham was never ambiguous about the central target. In February, he said, "China is the key. China must feel the pain." Speaking in Kyiv the day before his death, he even went further. Senator Graham argued that Beijing had more leverage over Putin than Washington, and that the road to ending the war, therefore, passed through China. China indeed has leverage over Russia without sharing the interest in ending the war. This is a fact. And this is mentioned to me by all and every China watcher and China expert I know. Yeah, and Russia continues fighting because it continues receiving revenue. From who? China and India, most of all. Together, China and India account for roughly 86% of Russian crude exports. That doesn't mean that every dollar from every barrel travels directly into a Russian missile factory, but that's a central source of Russian revenue. And that means any serious attempt to reduce Russia's energy income eventually encounters the same geopolitical fact. You cannot target Russia's oil revenues without targeting the countries buying the oil. And you cannot target the largest buyer without confronting China. On July 10th, Lindsey Graham, Richard Blumenthal, Jean Shaheen, and Roger Wicker announced that they had reached an agreement with the Trump administration on an updated Russia sanctions legislation. The official statement was quite broad. It promised to impose a heavy price on those buying Russian oil and natural gas. If the revised version would focus specifically on 5 countries purchasing Russian energy for resale, countries acting as intermediaries or helping Russia circumvent the sanctions, that's an important change. The original text punished the fact of the purchase of Russian energy. The new version may focus narrowly on the laundering or resale of Russian energy. That's not the same strategy. A resale-focused bill could leave a large amount of direct Chinese consumption untouched. But we do not yet know that China has been exempted. So the honest conclusion is not that China has definitely been removed. We don't know yet. But it's that China has become the test by which the final text must be judged. Let's be real. If a 500% tariff on imports from China would apply to all goods and services from that country, that amounts to something close to a trade embargo. It would disrupt supply chains, increase prices for American consumers. It most probably would provoke Chinese retaliation and damage American companies. Yeah, and it can potentially detonate any broader trade understanding between Washington and Beijing. So the danger is real, but the proposal was supposed to create leverage and danger. A threat has power only when the other side believes you might actually carry it out. The China-exempt bill may still produce results, but it's not the same. Not the same as confronting the principal economic relationship keeping Russian economy afloat. The legislation had 85 co-sponsors. That's a remarkable bipartisan majority in a Senate that struggles to agree on, well, what weather it is today, right here, or what day it is today. So yeah, it was widely supported. The variable was the White House. Senate leaders repeatedly held back, while Trump pursued his own strategy toward Putin. Trump repeatedly asked Republicans to wait while his administration, his representative, attempted to create diplomatic leverage through some other means. Only after negotiations with the Trump administration did Graham announce that the version had finally received the White House support. And even now, the final structure remains unsettled. Congress can construct the weapon. It can display the weapon proudly. It can hold hearings about the weapon and even give the weapon a magnificent bipartisan name. But the president largely determines whether it is aimed, triggered, or if it's left standing in storage. Lindsey Graham died convinced he had achieved a breakthrough. His colleagues now want to finish his work. The legislation may pass. It may receive overwhelming bipartisan support, not only in the Senate, but also in the House. It may even carry Graham's name. The speeches will describe it as a powerful response to Putin. But the actual legacy will not be determined by the speeches or even by the title of the bill. It will be determined by the fine print. Does the legislation punish countries for purchasing Russian energy or only for reselling it? Does it directly cover China and India, the 2 largest buyers? Are the sanctions mandatory once Russia is found to be obstructing peace? How broad are the presidential waivers? Can the administration delay implementation indefinitely? Those are kind of technical questions, but this is real politics. Russia has survived Western pressure, not because the sanctions were entirely imaginary, but because Russian trade adapted. It moved eastward, and the enforcement from the European Union and from the US often stopped where the geopolitical costs became too high. China is where the real financial costs become too high for the United States. So when the revised text finally appears, ignore the ceremony for a moment, ignore the name on the bill, ignore the claims that it's historic and devastating. Look for China. Because the sanctions bill that doesn't reach Russia's largest oil consumer and the sponsor of the war may still be useful, but it will not be the strategy Lindsey Graham spent his final years describing. It will be a compromise, and that's a very different legacy. I'll be watching for it, and I hope you will too. And I'll see you at the next one. Please hit that like button.